To once again address you as your only Chief Secretary of the THA at this point in time, to bring you up to date with a number of pressing issues that have been grabbing the attention of the people of Tobago and even the national community at this point in time. Of course, we did not have the usual Carnival celebrations last Monday and yesterday, but I hope that persons would have remained safe. I saw on social media, via my social media feed, a number of persons took the opportunity to reminisce by posting old videos and photos of previous Carnival experiences. And I could imagine the gross levels of tabanka experienced by many, Carnival tabanka that is. And therefore I hope that in spite of the circumstances, that persons still remained safe. For those who chose to celebrate Carnival in small numbers, as I've seen a number of videos circulating to that effect as well, I hope that all of us remain safe and maintained the COVID-19 protocols and guidelines. We are in a good place at this point in time with respect to that. Of course, there are no cases on the island as I speak, but that does not mean that we ought to be complacent. We must continue to adhere to the guidelines. Yes, we have avoided the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic, but other countries throughout the world continue to have real and very dangerous experiences with this pandemic, and therefore it continues to be a deadly virus. It continues to take lives, and even us here in Trinidad and Tobago continue to grapple with the economic consequences of this pandemic. But today, not that I expect it to be, but I still stand as the Chief Secretary of the Tobago House of Assembly. Of course, we conducted a very vigorous campaign over the last 2 months. The two main political parties on the island, the People's National Movement and the Progressive Democratic Patriots, fielded 12 candidates each, and in addition to that, there were some other independent candidates who participated as well. So the elections were held, as all of us are aware, on January 25th, and surprisingly to many of us, it ended in a 6-6 deadlock. As you all know, there are 12 seats in the Tobago House of Assembly. The People's National Movement, however, won the popular vote, and since then there has been a number of opinions flooding the public domain as to where we go next as an island, as a country, as an institution called the Tobago House of Assembly. I remember, I think it was the day after the election, the deputy political leader of the PDP suggested that we should use the popular vote since it was the most democratic thing to do, and that the popular vote should determine who forms the next executive of the Tobago House of Assembly. It did turn out, however, that the People's National Movement won the popular vote. In addition to that, there are other suggestions out there, even from the opposition leader in the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago, that we should resort to the standing orders of the National Parliament in order to resolve this 6-6 deadlock. But I want to say to the people of Tobago that immediately after recognizing that the results of the election will indeed be an unprecedented 6-6, I sought legal advice. And there was a lot of back and forth between myself and the senior state counsel of the Tobago House of Assembly, Ms. Leslie Gray. And of course, we relied on legal advice from two senior counsels who, in my opinion, are worth their salt. Senior counsels who would have gotten that recognition based on their experience and based on their capacity within the legal fraternity, not others who may have given themselves silk, but we relied on advice from two senior counsels in the persons of Messrs. Russell Martino, SC, and Elton Prescott, SC. So notwithstanding all that was said, all the speculation and pontification and legal opinions from lawyers and even bush lawyers here, there, and everywhere, I sought legal advice as the Chief Secretary of the Tobago House of Assembly. And of course, I asked those lawyers through the Senior State Counsel a number of questions. One, of course, concerning the status of the current Chief Secretary and the Executive Council, and all the advice supported what was very clear in the THA Act, that in spite of the 6-6 deadlock, we still had a Chief Secretary and an Executive Council in place. And that can be found between Section 33 and Section 36 of the Tobago House of Assembly Act, and that is quite clear. But of course, 2 days after the election, I think it was on Thursday after the election, all 12 assemblymen were sworn in as legally required by the Tobago House of Assembly Act, and all of us were administered the oath of office by the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Following that, the very said day, we went to the House of Assembly again as required by law to elect a presiding officer. And all of us are aware that after 3 attempts, we have not yet been able to agree on a presiding officer of the Tobago House of Assembly. And therefore, we remain with an unconstituted Tobago House of Assembly. We remain without a presiding officer, without a minority leader, and of course, without the appointment of any councillors to the Tobago House of Assembly. And therefore, under the current arrangement, the Chief Secretary and the Executive Council remained in place. Notwithstanding the provisions in the law, I did ask for the resignation of those secretaries who did not seek re-election, and therefore, had it not been for this 6-6 situation, they would not have been part of the Executive Council. And of course, all those individuals were replaced as assemblymen within their former electoral districts. And therefore, it was on that basis that I requested and received the resignations of those 3 gentlemen. But of course, there are some who are suggesting that we can look to the standing orders of the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago to resolve this deadlock. And again, I sought legal advice from the 2 very distinguished gentlemen that I spoke about earlier, Messrs. Russell Martino, SC, and Elton Prescott, SC. And according to their legal advice, and I want to read Section 92 of the Tobago House of Assembly Standing Orders. And I'm reading this, of course, in the context of the THA Act, Section 7, which spells out quite clearly that it is the assemblymen who shall elect a presiding officer of the Tobago House of Assembly. Not the assembly, not the house, but the assemblymen. And I think, and the lawyers who advise me agree as well, that that is quite clear and unambiguous, that it is the assemblymen who are empowered by law to elect the presiding officer. But some are suggesting that we should use Section 92, which will allow us to draw lots as is provided for in the standing orders of the National Parliament. But I want to remind the people of Tobago that when the National Parliament is convened for the election of a speaker, a prime minister would have already been appointed by the president. So they go to the House to elect a speaker already knowing who the Prime Minister and the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago will be. In the Tobago House of Assembly, however, if there is a deadlock in the election of a Chief Secretary or a Deputy Chief Secretary, the very said presiding officer who is elected by the Assemblymen will in fact have a casting vote and determine who the Chief Secretary will be, and by extension will also determine who the government of Tobago or the administration of the Tobago House of Assembly will be. And therefore, I want to read Standing Order 92 of the THA's Standing Orders. 92.1. In any matter not herein provided for, resort shall be had to the usage and practice of the House of Representatives of Trinidad and Tobago, which shall be followed as far as the same may be applicable to this assembly, and not inconsistent with these standing orders, nor with the practice of this assembly. But section 92 of the standing orders, as I know, and as I was also legally advised, must also be read and understood in conjunction with Standing Order 9 of the same standing orders. And Standing Order 9 speaks to the general authority of the presiding officer. And I'm going to read 9.1 and 9.2. And it reads, the presiding officer shall have power to regulate the conduct of business in all matters not provided for in the standing orders. The decision in all cases for which these standing orders do not provide shall lie within the discretion of the presiding officer and shall not be open to challenge except on a substantive motion. And therefore this tells us, and even if the Tobago House of Assembly Act was not clear enough, and I said before, it is quite clear in that the assemblymen must elect the presiding officer. So even if the THA Act was not clear, and even if the suggestions by some that we should use Standing Order 92 was to be considered, it has to be looked at in conjunction with Standing Order 9, which suggests that it is the presiding officer that has the powers to deliberate on such an issue. And therefore, the clerk of the assembly is only legally empowered to conduct an election and not necessarily to interpret the usage of the standing orders. So I'm informing the people of Tobago that when they hear suggestions of using Standing Order 92, that they should quickly find themselves a copy of the said standing orders and read Standing Order 9 as well of the same document. And therefore, since we are unable to elect a presiding officer, the only way, and again, I have been legally advised that the only way to get out of this current situation is an amendment to the Tobago House of Assembly Act. Because the THA Act, again, is quite clear of how elections are called. And the only way to call an election in the Tobago House of Assembly is for the House of Assembly to pass a resolution to dissolve itself. And following that dissolution of the House, of course, an election can be held somewhere between 2 to 3 months of that dissolution. And if there is no House to dissolve itself, it therefore means that as we speak, we are not legally empowered to call any election as per the current Tobago House of Assembly Act. And it was in that context, following all that legal advice, following lengthy and robust discussions with those two gentlemen through the Senior State Counsel's office, it was in that context and based on that advice that I called on the Prime Minister of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago to intervene, because I want to make it abundantly clear that there is one government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. And whether it is a PNM government as it is now, our government led by another party. It is the government of Trinidad and Tobago which has the power to do certain things. And therefore I call on the Prime Minister to intervene and look at the possibility of legislative amendments to allow us to do two things. One, be able to call another election as quickly as possible, and of course with some adjustments to the number of seats, because it will not be sensible for us at this point in time to go back to the polls with 12 seats when the possibility is that the same thing can happen again. And therefore, following that, the Prime Minister did announce in the Parliament that the government will lay in the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago a bill that will seek to bring to reality two very simple amendments. It is not rocket science. It's a very simple process that will now provide for the Act to empower the members, the current members of the Tobago House of Assembly, to be able to call an election. And of course, based on those amendments, the Chief Secretary, in the absence of the Tobago House of Assembly at this point in time, because as I said before, the House is not fully convened, and technically there is no assembly, although there is an executive council. And of course, these amendments will allow for the Chief Secretary to be able to call an election given the circumstances. And this is consistent with the current arrangements at the national level, where the Prime Minister can call an election. But of course, the Chief Secretary will be required to consult with the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. And it leads me to the second amendment, which again is not rocket science, because all Tobagonians must recall that over many years, right, and I think the final bill that is before the Parliament at this point in time was approved sometime in 2016. That bill that is before the Parliament represents the views, the wishes, and the aspirations of the people of Tobago where internal self-government is concerned. I myself was part of many of those meetings where hundreds of Tobagonians came out to one of the largest meetings I ever saw dealing with this issue. It was at the Signal Hill Secondary Comprehensive School, and the hall was almost filled. In addition to that, thousands of Tobagonians participated in a number of meetings and discussions across many communities here on the island. And one of the things that we agreed on, which made its way into the bill that is before the Parliament at this point in time, is that we should move from 12 to 15 seats. So the government did not pull 15 seats from a hat. As a matter of fact, if that internal self-government bill was approved before now, Tobago would have had an election with 15 seats before now. And therefore, it is nothing new. It is simply part of the recommendations of the internal self-government bill that is before the Parliament. And given the current circumstances, and given the fact that it will not be possible for us to pass that bill through the Parliament at this point in time, of course, my expectation is that it's going to take at least another year. And none of us are prepared to exist in this situation for another year. And therefore, the fastest way to resolve it, hopefully within the next 6 months, is for us to make those two simple amendments to allow us to call an election in the current circumstances and to allow us to change the number of seats from 12 to 15, as is recommended in the internal self-government bill that came about as a result of a number of consultations with the people of Tobago over many years. So as Chief Secretary at this point in time, I am quite comfortable that that is the way to go. Of course, once that bill is passed, the EBC, that independent body called the Elections and Boundaries Commission, must then engage in fieldwork to determine how these 15 seats will come about. I've seen a number of discussions as to where these seats might be, and it's not a matter of simply splitting one seat into two. That is not how the process works as far as I'm aware. The EBC will be required to conduct an exercise that will allow them to determine through a report to the Parliament, which the Parliament will then have to approve the number of seats as recommended by the law when it is amended, and where these seats will be formulated, or what will be the boundaries of these seats. And that is for the EBC to decide, and I hope they conduct this exercise as quickly as possible. So here we are. That is the situation. A number of persons are talking a lot of stuff. Some based on their own legal advice, I suspect. Some, as I said before, are simply what we might call bush lawyers. And therefore, I am operating based on the law. I am operating based on the legal advice given. And the law certainly does not permit us at this point in time to toss a coin or draw any lot with respect to the election of a presiding officer, or even with respect to the election of a Chief Secretary of the Tobago House of Assembly. So the current Chief Secretary and the executive remains in place until such time. In my last address to the people of Tobago and this country by extension, I made it abundantly clear that we will conduct the affairs and the business of the people of Tobago with prudency given the current circumstances, and we will discharge our responsibilities as effectively and as impartially as possible, as we have been accustomed to over the last term. So, of course, the process continues. I look forward to a speedy resolution to this current situation. And as I said to the people of Tobago, it requires patience. It requires for us to, of course, let our voices be heard. Talk as much as you possibly can. This is, in fact, a democracy. But, of course, I expect that persons will act responsibly and respectfully, even as we deliberate on these matters that is important to every single Tobagonian, and I'm sure as well to every citizen of this country called Trinidad and Tobago. So I am looking forward to that process. I am also looking forward to the advancements of the internal self-government bill that is before the Parliament. I am told that the Joint Select Committee that is responsible for it at this point in time has been given a deadline of May this year to complete its work. So I look forward to that bill being advanced so that the people of Tobago will be afforded the kind of autonomy and the kind of self-determination that we have been so long fighting for, that we had said decisively back in 2016 in the form of that bill that is before the Parliament, that we want internal self-government, and in the prescribed format in which it was submitted to the Parliament. So I look forward to that coming to fruition. The final issue I want to discuss is, of course, the airport project. I looked at my phone and I scrolled through comments under a particular post of a news reporter, and I looked on in amazement. And let me say, firstly, that the Tobago House of Assembly and I as Chief Secretary, and I hope that every Tobagonian will be in support of that airport project. Because just like Barbados, just like St. Lucia, just like St. Vincent, just like Trinidad, just like Grenada, and just like every Caribbean island that is serious about its development and serious about tourism, Tobago deserves a world-class, state-of-the-art airport facility that is in keeping with international standards and requirement. And I think all of us can safely conclude, especially if we are honest with ourselves, that the current airport facilities does not meet those requirements. and therefore we need a new airport terminal building at this point in time. But of course, development has a cost, and at this point in time, I empathize with all the affected residents from Crown Point and environs that are impacted by this development. And therefore, the law prescribes that in this process of compulsory acquisition, that persons must be compensated at market value for their property, and that process is ongoing. But unfortunately, at this point in time, and just as we had with the Sandals project, that caused us to miss that opportunity, that golden opportunity, there is a lot of mischief being made at this point in time. And therefore, I want to say to the people of Tobago, especially those residing in that area, that there is no plans by the government of Trinidad and Tobago at this point in time for any further land acquisition apart from the 53 acres that have already been approved by the cabinet to be acquired, and the 12 acres that was part of an arrangement since 1996. I saw again a post on Facebook today that by the time I began this press conference had almost 300 comments. A number of persons making a lot of irresponsible statements. A lot of them are trying to pull the race card and making comments concerning Hilton Sandy's unfortunate comments that were made during the 2013 Tobago House of Assembly elections campaign. And the PNM and myself, specifically, I want to speak for myself, distanced ourselves from that comment back then. And even today, I will once again distance myself from those statements, those unfortunate statements made back then. And therefore, it is quite irresponsible of any Tobagonian to, at this time, revoke and revive those statements and to engage in the kind of mischief that I'm seeing taking place where this project is concerned. It has the potential to misinform, to mislead, and to derail this entire process. And I'm saying once again that this project is important to the people of not only Tobago, but Trinidad and Tobago, and that there are serious benefits that can be derived by the people of Tobago through this new airport. Tobago is in need of a better airport facility. And of course, there are some who may say that the borders are closed and no international arrivals are permitted at this point in time. But should we wait for international arrivals to return to fix our airport? I will suggest not. And therefore, I'm calling on persons to be more responsible. Yes, we are still in the political season, but we must not be so politically irresponsible that we risk the kind of development and the kind of opportunities that are needed for the people of Tobago at this point in time. So I'm seeing a lot of misleading information about the government acquiring lands to build condominiums and all sorts of misinformation. I want to make it abundantly clear as Chief Secretary of this island at this point in time that there is no other acquisition process to be had other than the 53 acres that were already approved by the cabinet. And of course, that process is ongoing because not everybody has already completed the process as yet. So it is ongoing. And I want to say as well that the Tobago House of Assembly went a step further, because while it was not required by law for us to add any level of compensation, we did in fact commit to a process because we believed that it will make lives for those persons affected by this situation easier. And therefore we undertook two projects, two land development projects, one in Sherburne for residential purposes and another in Cove for commercial activities. And I am pleased to announce that at this point in time, both areas are accessible to all those persons impacted by the airport development, persons who have completed their negotiations and who are interested in purchasing those lands at highly reduced rates. I think in Chauvin it's $30 per square foot, and in Cove it's $50 per square foot, highly reduced from market rates. And therefore persons can now go to the airport relocation committee, go to that office, and begin the process to acquire those lands. And I'm pleased to announce that construction has already started. Some persons have begun constructing their new homes, and therefore the process is ongoing. And let me say as well that no amount of compensation is sufficient to compensate anybody for having to move from a place they called home for many years. No amount of compensation will be able to compensate persons for all the hard work, for all the memories, for all the relationships, and for all the bonds that they would have formed in those locations. And therefore we understand that it is quite difficult, and hence we are trying our best to ensure that the process is as seamless and as easy as possible for those persons. In addition to that, I should say as well that we are allowing persons to begin construction of their new homes after making that first down payment of 50%. So once that initial down payment is made of 50%, persons can move on to the property and start construction of their new homes pending the payment of the balance. Right? So we are simply trying to facilitate affected persons, but I'm asking the people of Tobago, especially those who might be politically opposed to the current administration, to be more responsible. Tobago needs this kind of development like yesterday, just as we needed the Sandals development at that point in time. And I want to debunk another trend that I'm seeing out there. Because one of the persons who said that condominiums will be built, and that is false by the way, as I said before, but the person even said that the owners of those condominiums will not look like us. And that to me is an attempt to incite some kind of racial emotions in the people of Tobago. And I'm saying we ought to be careful. And that person, unfortunately, was a PDP candidate in the 2017 Tobago House of Assembly elections. And I'm saying persons ought to be more responsible. Because the reality is, Butch Stewart, may God bless his soul, a Caribbean man who achieved a lot, right, in terms of his business operations, Sanders Resorts International. Butch Stewart, we can safely say, does not look like us. A number of the persons who come to Tobago to support our tourism product may not look like us. But at the end of the day, I like to say that there is one human race. And as I said some time ago in an address to the people of Tobago, I think it was for Independence or Republic Day, right, that the only percentage that is important is not 1% or 2% or 3% or 50% or how much ever percent, but it's the 100% Trinbagonians that call this place home. And therefore any attempt to use this project to racially divide us, right, has to be treated with scant courtesy and must be rejected in the strongest possible terms. And I want to reiterate that there are no plans by the government at this point in time to acquire any additional lands for this project. So anybody living in the Crown Point area, if you have not been told by the government before that they needed to acquire your land, rest easy, right? There is no need to panic. There is no need to become worked up, because as I said before, there are no plans by the government of Trinidad and Tobago to acquire additional lands for that project, which is the new airport terminal building. So in closing, of course, I will take some questions. I want to ask the members of the media as well to be more responsible, because of course sometimes one statement can be taken out of context. So I'm asking all of us as Tobago people, as citizens of Trinidad and Tobago to be more responsible, because that is part of the change that is required in us. Of course, we talk about protecting each other and protecting women from violence and that kind of stuff. A lot of those things unfortunately happen on social media. Defamation, right? A lot of misleading and deliberate attempts to misinform and mislead and incite. A number of cyberbullying and even outrightly abusing people takes place on social media. And I'm saying to all of us as citizens, we ought to be more responsible if we claim to love ourselves and if we claim to love this great island and this great Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Then we owe it to ourselves to not only be more responsible, but also to call out those who are irresponsible and ask them to do better. So at this point in time, I will take some questions.
Thank you, Honorable Ansel Dennis. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Davia Chambers, and I'll take you through this afternoon's question and answer segment. As usual, members of the media, please indicate that you have a question by raising your virtual hand. We'll allow a maximum of 2 questions per person in the first round before we proceed to another round of questions. Elizabeth Williams, TV6 News.
Hi, good afternoon,
Good
Mr.
afternoon.
Chief Secretary.
Good afternoon, how are you?
I am fine. What I wanted to get a comment from you with respect to Tobago's recent murder, well, the first murder for the year in Tobago, your comments on that. And the second question is it that you are refuting what NITCO's chairman stated at the committee meeting that was publicized in terms of additional lands to be needed for the airport expansion project? Because he would have stated that, and it was on national television.
Right, so what I'll ask you to do is to review the comments of Mr. George again to see if that is what was exactly was said. Because I'm not aware, I haven't seen the comments, but based on a conversation that I've had with persons responsible, that is far from the truth. As I've said before, the plans are, of course, the government has approved the acquisition of 53 acres of land for the airport terminal building. A previous 12 acres was acquired some time ago, years ago, 1996. Those are the only acquisitions to take place, and the process is an ongoing one. So maybe in his observations or in his conversations, Mr. George may have been speaking to the continuation of the current process, in that we have not completed the process for a number of parcels that is included in that 53 acres. So maybe that is what should have been communicated. Again, I didn't hear the exact comments, but go back and see what Mr. George might have said, because as I said before, there are no plans to acquire any new parcels of land for the airport development project. And the first question, in terms of the murder, of course, it is always unfortunate when lives are lost, especially in violent circumstances. And therefore, I sympathize with the family of the most recent murder victim and to all persons who would have experienced the loss of loved ones in violent circumstances. We must continue as an island to be our brother's keeper. I mean, we say it a lot. We talk about it a lot, but it is something that we really need to demonstrate as residents of this island and as citizens of this country, that we really need to be our brother's keeper. I spoke before now about some of the things that I see on social media. A lot of violent and abusive statements being meted out to fellow human beings. And it's as simple as loving our neighbors as we love ourselves. Yes, we will not always agree. Yes, we will have differences of opinions from time to time. Yes, we will have difficulties in relationships, but violence is never the solution, and violence should never be condoned. right? And therefore, we have to do more as a society. We have to do more even as an administration to really treat with the scourge of violence that is plaguing, of course, mostly the Sister Isle Trinidad, but even we here in Tobago are not immune from that. And therefore, we must continue to do what is necessary to ensure that we change our society at this point in time.
Clayton Clark, Radio Tambourine. Good afternoon, Clayton.
Good afternoon, Davia, and to Mr. Dennis.
Good afternoon, sir.
My question, you said that you are comfortable with the Prime Minister's announcement. I'm trying to paraphrase here. Just want to get an idea the extent of consultation you or the PNN Tobago had with the Prime Minister in terms of commenting the decision about the amendment to the act.
Well, I am Chief Secretary of the Tobago House of Assembly, and the Tobago Act, for some reason, specifies that the Prime Minister and the Chief Secretary should have discussions from time to time. And we engage in a number of discussions relating to Tobago issues, relating to even national issues. And of course, following my call to have him intervene in this matter, there were some discussions, and therefore those discussions will continue to be had on a number of matters relating to Tobago's business.
My second question, the current executive, which you said legal advice has given, is in place. You have been leading this current executive council. How has it been? There's less members, some members taking on double responsibility. How has that been for you and the executive council, and the pressure of operating in this 6-6 deadlock situation?
Stress galore. Well, at least for me, it has been a stressful time. Required to do more, taking on an additional division has been a challenge. So I'm now managing the Office of the Chief Secretary, Division of Tourism, Culture and Transportation, and also the Division of Agriculture, well, food production, forestry and fisheries, which has a lot of work to be done. And therefore, it is very challenging. But with the help of God and with the help of the team and with the help of public servants involved in this process, and of course with the help of the people of Tobago, I think we can get it done and we can achieve a lot during this particular period. And it was, due to that situation that I seriously considered, and in one case I acted on it. The secretaries that were asked to resign, I thought it might have helped, right, if they, with their institutional knowledge and with their experience over the last 4 years as secretaries, though being asked to resign and though being asked to step back from those responsibilities, I felt that they could have contributed in some way in a capacity as advisors, right, in those respective divisions, to make the burden and to make the work a bit lighter. But of course, I've since changed my approach in that regard, following discussions with the secretaries who are assigned Youth Affairs and Sport and Education. They gave me the assurance that they can, in fact, manage, and I expect them to manage. But of course, in the Division of Agriculture, the former secretary is assisting me at this point in time in that division. The institutional knowledge and knowing of some of the operations within the division is relieving some of the stress, and therefore that is the situation at this point in time. So one of them was engaged, the other two will not be engaged.
Lois Vincent, Guardian Media Limited. Good afternoon, Lois.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Mr. Dennis, we understand that the Division of Infrastructure brought on, well, we heard, a large amount of staff following last month's election. Is that so?
Well, what
Can
you
you
mean?
say at all?
What you mean large amounts? My information is I think 40 persons were engaged as relief or casual workers to assist with the maintenance challenges. Because one of the things Tobago people will tell you, especially at the level of all communities, is that there are challenges with maintenance. And I speak about it from time to time. I speak about the fact that as a young man growing up, the drains were always in pristine conditions to the point that we would play boat racing. When the rain fall, we will cut leaves and sticks and put them in the drain, and the drain was so clean they will float along as boats, we would call them. And for us, that was a game. But now, when you walk through most communities, and during my walkabouts before elections, during the elections, and even now, there are challenges with maintenance. That unit is significantly short-staffed. There are some vacancies, and of course, we have to balance that. We have to balance filling the vacancies with the availability of resources, because it will be highly irresponsible of us to hire persons that we cannot pay. And my information is that there are, I think, 40 persons were engaged. I do not consider that a lot. I've heard persons talking about 100, 200. That is simply incorrect.
Okay. My follow-up question is, another question is, were any Tobago companies or Tobagoans hired to provide services on board the new ferry, the APT James, and will any be hired to perform services on board the Buku Reef when it arrives or when it becomes operational?
I do not have that information. Usually in those processes, there are public tenders normally. And of course, every citizen of this country is allowed to vie for those opportunities. At the end of the day, it is an open process, but I have no information as to who will be engaged or anything of the sort. And I have no information as to whether or not it will be closed to only the people of Tobago. So I don't have that information at this point in time.
Okay.
Ryan McCool, you have another question, Lois?
Yes, I do. Sorry.
Okay, no problem.
Mr. Dennis, the Delaforce fishing facility is a little bit rundown. Any plans for that fishing facility?
Yes, we plan to repurpose it into an agro-processing facility that will treat with issues such as smoked fish and other forms of processed fish, and maybe other meats, because at this point in time, the fishermen seem to have no interest in utilizing it. And it is the same with a couple other facilities as well. So I've instructed the administrator to revisit those facilities, have some discussions with the fishermen. I think in some cases we may have to utilize the law to get them to occupy some of the facilities, because in some cases the current situation under which fishermen operate in terms of sale of fish is in fact a health hazard. Right? So there are some cases where fishermen should be required to utilize the facilities for the safety of all of us who purchase fish from Tobago's fishermen. But in other cases, we will simply have to repurpose them for a number of reasons. So I've instructed that process to begin, and I expect that very quickly it should take place.
Ryan McCool, Tobago Channel 5. Good afternoon, Ryan.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Mr. Dennis, let me firstly ask you, can you specifically explain how the proposed amendment to the THA Act will treat with progressing a re-election with the current deadlock, and how will the current assemblymen in this present situation be able to represent their districts and the persons within their districts with there being no house convened?
As I speak,
while being on salary, that is.
Right, as I speak, all assemblymen should have been given instructions or should have been provided with the necessary information to establish their electoral district offices. Mine is up and running, and therefore I continue to represent my constituents in my electoral districts. Right? So even if the House is not convened, constituents out there need support, Some of them need assistance that assemblymen can provide, and therefore offices should and will be established, and assemblymen will be required to carry out those duties until such time where we can get back to the polls. Remind me of the other question, please.
Oh, that was to speak with specifically how the proposed amendment to the THA Act, how will it treat with progressing the re-election?
How will it treat with progressing to the re-election?
Yeah, well, progressing a re-election, because I remember you stating that specifically, and the Prime Minister stating it in the amendment when he made it.
So the act. So based on what I've seen in the bill that was laid in the Parliament, it allows the Chief Secretary to call an election. The Tobago House of Assembly Act, as it is now, does not allow for that. The only way to call an election is for the Tobago House of Assembly to agree to a resolution, right? To simply move a motion, as I did, I think it was November the 17th, where I moved a motion that the House now be dissolved, and the majority of assemblymen agreed. I think all of them agreed, and we passed that resolution, and therefore the House dissolved itself. Currently, that cannot happen because there is no House, there is no presiding officer to go to the House to debate or to resolve anything. Right? So the only way to get back to the polls legally is to change the provisions of that act to allow some mechanism for the calling of another election. And I think the proposal is that the Chief Secretary, in consultation with the President, will be able to call that election. So I think that is the proposal before the Parliament.
All right, well, Mr. Dennis, I'm glad that you said that, because I must represent persons, their concerns from in the public. And they're wondering, well, why isn't there some form of political maturity coming from all entities? Because it would have been uttered from you, the political leader, and even from those on the other side, that the only way, even the Prime Minister said that the only way out of this is back to the polls. Isn't there some way, or can't all these parties come together and do some contractual agreement where just to have the presiding officer be elected, just to have the Chief Secretary, just to have those processes being done to dissolve the House? How possible is that?
Well, that is up to the leaders of the party at the end of the day. And I saw with my own eyes where we could not even reach agreement on a date to go back to the House to attempt to elect another presiding officer. Right? One person suggested that, well, let me say who it is, the political leader of the PDP suggested that we should stay there whole night until we elect one, going over the same process, yea, nay, whole night until we elect a presiding officer. The political leader on our side suggested that, look, let's agree on a particular date and time that we could come back, ever so often and do the process, because the result is not really being achieved. And they could not agree on that, right? So I think it's good to say, and a lot of people will say it, but in reality, it's up to the leaders of the party to agree on that. And my position is that the only way to resolve it is to get back to the polls. I really don't expect the PDP to support our choice for presiding officer. Neither are we going to support their choice for presiding officer. And if the two parties could not simply agree on a date to get back to the House, one suggested we should stay there all night and sleep. One said, well, let's come back on another date that we all can agree on and attempt this process again. So I really do not expect any agreement. I will not even call it immaturity. It is simply politics. And it's that way all over the world. And some may even suggest that it is not in the best interest of the island. I disagree with that, because at the end of the day, both parties believe that they have the best plans to manage this island. Let's remove all the fluff. Yes, we engage, unfortunately, sometimes in personal attacks, quite unfortunately. Yes, a lot of people say things on the campaign trail that should not be said, but I think at the end of the day, it boils down to the PDP believing that we have the best plans, we should be given a chance, and therefore we're not going to support the other party continuing. We in the PNM believe that we have the best plans to take this island forward. We believe that we should continue to take this island forward, and therefore we will not support the PDP and their plans. And that's the reality of politics. And let me just say a little bit on coalition governments, because of course in some countries it is attempted. In the UK situation, which we mirror some of our operations upon, they have arrangements where if one party does not win sufficient seats and where you have a hung parliament, because of the number of parties who may have won seats, parties may decide that they want to come together and form a coalition government, and of course they will agree on certain terms. In other cases, there is an agreement called a supply and something agreement. I can't remember what it is. A supply and something agreement, where the parties will basically, a minority party will agree to support the policies and bills that the government will bring. And of course, they wouldn't necessarily get involved in a coalition, but they will agree to support the ideas and the programs of the government. And therefore, they are guaranteed, in a sense, the support of that minority party, right? So that at least they could get things done. And that is what it's about at the end of the day. You need sufficient votes in the House to be able to pass a budget, to be able to make critical decisions, and to be able to advance the country. Without that, then it's always back to the polls.
Caricia Douglas of TTT. Good afternoon, Caricia.
Pleasant afternoon, Mr. Dennis. I'm going back to the situation of this amendment and addressing the 6-6 deadlock. We know that following one of the meetings at the Assembly Legislature, you would have mentioned in terms of the timeline that you are hoping for to have this address. You mentioned 6 months, but of course, time has elapsed, and there's a process that they have to go through if we're going back to the polls and going with the amendments of this THA Act. What timeline, though, are you hoping for to have the EBC carry out their work and all the parliamentary work to be carried out?
As soon as possible. I do not intend to remain Chief Secretary for too long under the circumstances, right? I will even call this Executive Council a caretaker one, and therefore this situation should not be allowed to continue for very long. And my hope is that within 6 months from the date when I said it was 6 months, so maybe by now it's 5 months, within 5 months this has to be resolved. And once the Parliament does what needs to happen, then the EBC can begin their work, and I don't see that taking too long at all. By the way, the agreement, Mr. McCool, is a confidence and supply agreement, right? That is basically an agreement where two parties, without forming a coalition, so if the majority is 9 seats, I have 5, you have 4, somebody else at 3, and we need 9 to pass certain things, we may decide we're not going to form any coalition. You will stay out of my government. I have 5. We sign a confidence and supply agreement. Based on that agreement, you will agree to support my budget and other critical proposals that I will bring to the House. And that is how it's done in the UK and in other places. I just couldn't remember the full name of the agreement. So it's a confidence and supply agreement.
I have another question as it relates to your portfolio in the division of food production fisheries. I know you have been visiting various sites on the island, the fishing facilities, you have been to the market. Tell us some of the challenges that you have noticed and some of the priority areas that you plan to really address during your time at this division.
The time is unpredictable, I'm not sure how long I will be there for. Could be 2 months, could be 1 more month, we don't know. But so far, I have seen some progress. In other areas, there are challenges to be resolved. I think at this point in time, as I've been saying and as I've been doing all along, we have to place serious emphasis on food production, more emphasis than we were doing before. So I think based on what I've seen, the market, the vendors are quite comfortable in most cases. They are quite appreciative of the upgrade works. Vendors and their customers alike are quite supportive. There are challenges in some of our off-site stations, Louis Door Nursery, I am not satisfied with the facilities there. Hope Farm, I'm not satisfied with what is taking place at Hope Farm. And therefore, upon my visit to those places, I instructed the administrator to immediately do an assessment as to the objectives that are being realized by those places and to determine how we could better position those facilities to assist us as Tobagonians and as a country in delivering our objectives to the people of Tobago, of course, through the farmers. The tissue culture lab is going quite well. I think there are some serious developments taking place there under the manager, Ms. Shawanda McFarlane. I think she's doing a tremendous job. However, there is a need for us to increase capacity because at this point in time, demand outstrips supplies. And of course, Tissue Culture Lab will produce planting material, whether it be bananas, plantains, etc. for the farmers. And I am told that the demand is higher than what is produced by that lab, and therefore some action has to be taken to increase our capacity to supply more. Fishing facilities, there are some good things happening out there as well, where fishermen are actively pursuing their trade. There are some niggling issues to be resolved as well, and these are things that should not take long at all. I expect them to be resolved very quickly. In some cases, a fridge not working and these kinds of things. So these are things I intend to put the pressure on public servants, very great pressure to ensure that it is done and done quickly. We simply take too long in this place to do things. People must understand that when they come to work, it means work and it means business. Somebody's out there waiting for a service. Somebody's out there highly dependent on some kind of facility. And if people don't do their work in a timely manner, it will simply take too long. So my way of operating is to motivate, persuade, and in some cases, put pressure on the system to ensure that we simply get it done.
Clayton Clark, Radio Tambourine.
Yes, good afternoon again. This question to you, Mr. Dennis, as Secretary responsible for culture. Leading up to Carnival this year, we the media were inquiring as to what are the plans for today. We were informed that there are plans, but all dependent on the Executive Council approving the budget, and therefore whatever to be done will be done after Carnival. Yes, can you explain to us what happened? Was there a delay, etc.?
Well, the intent was never to have a carnival in its usual sense. As we know, COVID-19 did not or will not allow us, well, it's in the past, so did not allow us to have any carnival in the usual sense. Notwithstanding that, the creative sector is a critical part of our Tobago economy, and I will say the national economy as well, and it will even have to play a greater role in this new normal environment. Yes, we talk a lot and we push a lot tourism and agriculture and these sort of things, but creativity, our creative juices, our talents, our musicians, our dancers, our designers, our film producers and these kinds of individuals must begin to find their place. They must begin to experience the backing and the support of the assembly and the support of the government by extension in a way like never before. And that is one of the reasons why we moved quickly to establish the Tobago Performing Arts Company, because we felt that now is the time, given what has been transpiring with the pandemic and the effect that it has had on many areas of the economy. We felt that this time around we have to place serious emphasis and really support our creatives at this point in time. And therefore, while we will not be able to have Carnival and heritage festivals as we used to, at least for now, we feel strongly that there are opportunities for us to engage under the new normal circumstances utilizing virtual means, utilizing social distancing when necessary, to ensure that we can continue to have creativity and that we can continue to have festivals. So there is a recommendation to have a virtual carnival. Of course, that will simply mean recording certain elements of our culture, the pan, the calypso, the mass, and those sort of things, and packaging it into something of good and significant quality that will allow us to showcase it to the rest of the country, the world, and at the same time it will allow us to market Destination Tobago and to keep Tobago and our creativity, our abilities, our talents, and really keep what this destination means to the people of the world, what we do differently, right? Keep that alive in the minds of our visitors and potential visitors in the future. So it is in that context that I believe that we have to continue to engage in some form of investment in our creatives. Now, a lot of people, there has been a lot of concerns about the cost, because I think the proposal is $2 million. At the end of the day, this assembly has invested significantly more than that on rental assistance to persons in terms of keeping them with food on the table, keeping them in their homes and that sort of stuff. So rental assistance to individuals. A lot of food card support was given to individuals during this period. Even businesses were supported during this period to the tune of millions of dollars to ensure they keep going. So therefore, a proposal for $2 million to support our creatives, because the money is not going in space. The money is going to our panmen, our calypsonian, our designers, our creatives on the island. So I think an opportunity to stimulate that sector and to ensure that at the same time those persons who have been greatly impacted, because of course Princess Adana and Leslie Ann Ellis and others will tell you that since COVID they have not been able to engage in any significant levels of live performances, and therefore we have to be in a position to support those persons. So even outside of the carnival, the usual carnival, I think this will present an opportunity for our designers even to be able to have some form of income and to be able to practice their skill and to practice their talents even during this context. So it will be a part of our plans going forward to ensure that we are able to stimulate the creative sector. I read recently where the New Zealand government invested, I think it's $175 million in their creative sector. And therefore, we here must embrace and understand the power of our creativity, because I think if it's one thing we have going for us here in Tobago, is our ability to be creative. Those unique aspects of our culture that we should continue to harness and that we should continue to hone and promote and display, even during these quite abnormal circumstances.
Elizabeth Williams, TV6 News. Good afternoon again, Liz.
Hi, good afternoon. Mr. Chief Secretary, I know that there is a situation at the Louis D'Or Nursery. I don't know if repairs have already started there. I don't know if you're aware of the situation in terms of the area in need of repairs, the facility that is.
Well, I'm aware. I mean, I went to Louis D'Or myself, so I saw some of the madness that is taking place there. I have given instructions, as I said before, to the administrator of that division to treat with those matters urgently. There is money in the system to deal with it, and therefore I expect it to be done in short order. Right? None of our facilities should be left to come to the point of that we saw circulating on social media. So it has to be fixed. I think some action has already been taken to treat with some of those issues. And in addition to that, we simply, and I've asked for that as well, for facility maintenance program or schedule to be put in place, because in the assembly, we build a lot of things quite well. We build community centers, we build sporting facilities, we build fishing facilities, we build complexes, we build a lot, but we do not maintain quite well, and I expect that to change.
Lois Vincent, Guardian Media Limited. Good afternoon again, Lois.
Hi, good afternoon again. Mr. Dennis, just for the sake of clarity, you said that one secretary was brought back on a consultancy basis.
Advisor basis. He's paid.
Advisor, sorry.
Yes, as my advisor in the Division of Agriculture, not a consultancy. Advisory capacity.
Thank you
and
for
he's paid the same as any advisor in the Tobago House of Assembly.
Can you give us an idea of how much that is, if you can?
I think it's 19,000 somewhere there. That's the salary of an advisor in the Tobago House of Assembly.
Okay. My last question is: you spoke about repairs to the previous the facility at the agri facility. How about the maintenance or the upgrade work that was supposed to be done at the health compound at Signal Hill?
Health compound at Signal Hill. I have no
Yes.
information on that. Which health
Just
compound?
just before the election, there was a lot of video being circulated. There was one particular video circulated on social media, and the secretary, there was a following release saying that repairs were to be made to facilities at the Signal Hill compound at the health compound at Signal Hill.
I have no information on that, unfortunately. So you'll have to ask the Secretary of Health concerning that matter.
Okay, then. Thank you.
Welcome.
And we have one last question from Elizabeth Williams, TV6.
Yes, good afternoon. Following what Lois just asked, I just want to get this clear. You said that a secretary was brought back and in an advisory position. Who is that secretary? If you can name the person, please. I don't know if you named the person before, but if you can name the person, please.
Yeah, Hayden Spencer, the former Secretary of Agriculture.
He has been brought back as an advisor in the Agriculture Division.
As an advisor to me.
Production.
As an advisor
To
to
you.
me as Secretary of Agriculture on a month-to-month basis for the time that I'm there as the Secretary. And I said before that in order to make the burden lighter for me, because I now have 3 portfolios, I felt that I needed an advisor in that division to assist in that regard. And therefore, as the former secretary with the institutional knowledge, with him knowing what has been transpiring in the division, as the secretary for the last 4 years and as the assistant secretary for the previous 4 years, I felt that he was the best person to come there on a month-to-month basis. It's not going to be a contract because obviously I do not know how long I will be the Secretary of Agriculture for. It might be 2 months. We don't know when our next election will call. And I did not expect anybody to leave whatever they are doing now to come and work for me for 2-3 months or however long without any sense of predictability. And therefore I felt in order to make the situation a bit easier and to be able to manage the affairs of the people of Tobago, just as I have 2 advisors in the office of the Chief Secretary, I felt it necessary that with this 3rd portfolio, I will bring another advisor in the Division of Agriculture.
Is he the only secretary that has been brought back as an advisor?
Yes.
In the entire Executive Council?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So that brings us to the end of this week's Post-Executive Council media briefing. Members of the media, thank you so much for logging on and posing your questions. And of course, thank you to our viewing audience. I'm Davia Chambers, and do enjoy the remainder of your afternoon.